I have an agenda about gender. Now, before I get straight into it, I want to set the tone a little bit. And I want to introduce you to my grandson, Finn, because he's very dear to my heart. Now, the challenge, however, though, for Finn is that he's born into a time and place that's actually dangerous for boys and men. Does that sound a little bit harsh? Let me explain. 30 years ago, I sat in an auditorium very similar to this. And I was there for a couple of reasons. One was I was a new parent. And secondly, I was doing a great deal of work with individuals, families, and in particular, I was starting to see more and more men. And the person I was waiting to hear speak was Stephen Biddulph. And Stephen Biddulph had just released a book on manhood. So I was really excited because in those days, very few men would attend. Thank you. Very few men would attend help. They wouldn't seek help out because it wasn't sort of the done thing. It wasn't the manly thing to do. However, Stephen started putting the issue on to the agenda, and I was really, really happy to see that. To put it in context, I went to university at a time when essentially women's liberation and feminism was very much on the agenda. The conversation was around the fact that women had raised their voice to the point where they said, we don't want to be controlled by men anymore. Now, for a lot of us as men, that was a real challenge. And so Stephen was picking up on a dialogue that should have been happening in parallel with the conversation women were having about equality. And what he pointed out very clearly was that what we call our life is in fact a big act. Okay? And today we often talk about hiding behind the mask. And so from there, I went into thinking about, okay, so if I'm going to focus on working with men, how am I going to do that? What's the difference between men and women when they seek help, and what are the issues? And so the other issue that came up for me was, what's really underlying masculinity? We're fairly clear about what women were talking about. They were really in a social revolution looking for equality. As men, we had that whole power thing sewn up really, really, really well. And that is for most of our history, we were in charge. Now, women were putting up their hand and going, we got to share. And so for a lot of men, that was really, really challenging. And so with manhood, what I thought was starting was finally a very meaningful conversation about what it means to be a man. Unfortunately, my experience after 30 years is that the conversation keeps stalling. It's like we have this little ember that we carry around and we're about to light the fire and someone blows it out. Now, women have been exceptionally good at locating the conversation about equality at every level in society. As men, I don't believe we've been that successful. And so my challenge to all of you here is that we want to start a dialogue that parallels what's happened in women's culture. And that is that we want to start examining what masculine culture really is about. Now let me ask you, show of hands, who watches Game of Thrones? Okay, some. Who's watched Vikings? Okay, nice balance. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what some of the driving characteristics are in that story, because they're great stories. I love them. As you heard earlier on, I'm right into playing computer games. Assassin's Creed is one of my current favourites, right? They've all got a very, very particular agenda hanging off it, okay? And so what is it? Well, the first thing is, if you think about the Seven Kingdoms or Vikings, right, there are 4 specific drivers in the story. Okay? So what happened is that we as men developed into a culture that utilises those 4 characteristics. And those characteristics are essentially that we're territorial, that we're hierarchical, that we're acquisitional, and that we're competitive. Now, at a pinch, there's a fifth one, and that fifth one is that we can get, when we're stressed, combative. Okay? So the consequences of this culture is that we actually become reactive and not responsive in situations. In addition to that, we're also emotionally and behaviourally not as flexible as we could be. And one of the things that I see as a therapist and as a psychologist is that a lot of my work with men is that we're actually not that resilient. There's a real question about what is ailing us in our culture today. And that issue comes down to that point of our traditional masculine culture. So in essence, one of the things that we've ended up is a caricature in many respects that looks a little bit like that. We've become an Iron Age warrior in a digital age. And that's a bad mix. It's not a very good fit on many, many different levels. Imagine this guy at home in the bedroom. Not a really comfortable place for either of them. Now, I do a lot of work with couples, and one of the things that I find myself doing is acting as a mediator frequently, as if I'm in a gladiatorial pit. The other problem that we've got is that we've also ended up with this, which is that men and women are often pitted against each other rather than working together. So in our culture at the moment, we have two separate cultures running parallel that are not really clearly interacting very well a lot of the time. So let me get a little bit of a big history up, because one of the big light bulb moments for me was when I started looking at the question of when was the point of origin for that. So if we go back 70,000 years, human beings essentially lived as hunter-gatherers. And anyone in here who's got any sort of background in anthropology and so on will recognise that traditionally hunter-gatherers tended to be fairly egalitarian in their relationships. There was not a lot of sort of conflict in terms of competition. They also, very importantly, had a really good work-life balance. By definition, most hunter-gatherers spend about 20 hours or less chasing food. Now compare that with what we're doing today. That's a really significant difference. In our culture today, most of us spend upwards of 40 plus hours taking care of our livelihood. So the problem with that is it doesn't leave us a lot of time to think about how we are and what we're doing and where we want to go. So there's very little reflection in that process. So the hunter-gatherer was also fairly clear about their gender relationships. Now along came the big bang in human culture, and that was the agricultural revolution. Once we started settling down, the issue now became one of owning land. And in addition to owning land, we started to look at owning other things as well, including human beings. So human beings now became, in essence, property. So as a male, and this is where the issue becomes in, I now have property to protect. So a friend of mine suggested that if we're going to talk about agriculture, we really should also be including the issue about beer and bread and whether what the agricultural revolution was really focused on, more beer or more bread. Now I'm going to leave that to your own imagination. My suggestion from some of the research is that actually beer was a very important aspect in driving the agricultural revolution. Unfortunately, it did end up with some negative consequences. And in fact, even now, one of the big issues on our agenda is how fit we are not. One of the big issues in the agricultural revolution and leading up to the industrial revolution was that men started to think we were completely in charge of everything. And in fact, we did become the boss of all things, as my son put it very eloquently one day. Now, the issue here is that around 200 years ago, a lady called Mary Wollstonecraft decided to challenge a very fundamental idea that had slipped into the social consciousness, and that was that women were inferior. Now, if I say that here, everyone will go, well, that's crazy. And she, in fact, said the same thing. She said that women weren't inferior. What women lacked was education. And so she set into motion a process that led up to that place in the 60s and 70s and 80s where women started to take a very much greater role in an equitable society and pushing for rights through both legislation but also through our relationship with one another. Now, the problem with that whole thing was that we as men were a little bit slow in taking that up. Why? Well, if you think about it, we're territorial. We liked the way things were running. We didn't really necessarily want to change. Some of us perceived that there could be some real benefits in that, but overall there was a real resistance to it. Okay? So now we have two issues. One is that we have the issue of men wanting to protect themselves, and so in a sense when we put together being territorial, hierarchical, acquisitional and competitive, we become defensive. So one way of challenging that idea with men is usually I ask men, so when your partner says to you, honey, I need to talk to you, what's your first reaction? Now most men will go, if they're really honest, I think I'm in trouble. All right? So that is immediately a defensive reaction. If we weren't defensive, we'd be going, okay, what are we going to talk about? All right? So in that process, the relationship is already on back foot. So in regards to the movement of feminism and masculinity, we're now out of step. We're not only misaligned with our culture, but we're also misaligned in our individual relationships with each other as men and women. And this is where one of the sources really comes into focus when I work with parents, for example. One of the things that I get often from men is that they feel marginalised in parenting. They don't feel they have the same influence into bringing up children. And so one of the things that I talk about a lot with parents is how to formulate a way in which you can have relationships that are based on that level of aspiration where both of you are equally putting in. So the whole social revolution really came at a cost to both men and women. And one of the things that we're really needing to look at through a dialogue is how to correct that. Now, who would really like to live in an episode of Game of Thrones? Not really. It's pretty dodgy. It's pretty dangerous. Really not good for your health. So what's the alternative? And I talk about the fact that through a new dialogue, a new gender dialogue, we need to formulate a new way of thinking about masculinity, one that fits into the digital age. Remember, coming home in a suit of armour with a tie on is not going to work really, really well. So what would a new masculinity look like? So, from my perspective, if we look at those four drivers of the traditional masculine stereotype, we can actually replace them with a number of new ones. And Finn Diesel puts it into context. Now, he's a very manly man. And he says, being a male is a matter of birth. Being a man is a matter of age. Being a great man is a matter of choice. And so the question that always came up for me is, what is it that we need to choose? Because it is a choice. It is not something that we've born with. Masculinity is a social construct. It's not genetic. And I know there's been lots of people who's been looking for differences in brain structure and so on. But if you take a male and a female brain out of the skull and put it side by side, they don't look different. So the idea here is that masculinity, gender, is a social construct. So what sort of choices do we need to make? Well, my argument is that one of the first drivers that we need to start working with is we need to become more inclusive instead of so territorial. And that territorial issue is not just on an individual basis, but it works on an institutional, organisational and educational level as well. We need to teach children like Finn how to be inclusive. It is not necessarily going to be something that emerges organically because our institutional structures are still based on the traditional masculine stereotype. The second one is that as men, we need to get comfortable with equality equaling being different. We need to get used to the idea that we don't have to be the same to be equal. In fact, being different gives us a strength. I was reading something recently where the person sort of put out that they like surrounding themselves with like-minded people. Now, when I read that, I thought, oh, that sounds really good. But then when I thought about it, I thought, no, hang on a minute, that could be deadly dull, right? I like to have differences of opinions, of ideas. I like friction. As an only child, I grew up with relatively little conflict. So one of my learning curves was actually how to deal with conflict constructively. Unlike a lot of us, I chose not to be combative in conflict, which was really useful keeping my marriage going for the last 35 years. So the other aspect that we need to focus on is about being more distributive. The old traditional masculine model is about ownership, and what we're needing to look at is how to create a culture that allows for sharing. And unfortunately, in some environments, the idea of sharing has become a problem. Let me raise the issue about intellectual property. There is some evidence that technological innovation is actually plateauing out because of the issue about having legal intellectual property, so the dialogue around new ideas is not as open. People are reluctant to share ideas because they have a commercial value. Now, if I locate that into relationships, into all sorts of different aspects of politics, of commerce and so on, we can start to see that we're actually being really restrictive and it's not allowing us to expand. And so what's happening is that it's inhibiting change. And one of the issues around this is that as men, one of the problems that we have with changing is that we don't like it. We want to go back to the old ways, right? But it's not paying off. In fact, it's killing us. So finally, and this is one of the most important ones that I like to talk about, is that we, rather than being competitive, is we need to start learning how to be cooperative to a much, much greater degree. So that, for me, would be some of the 4 first principles of starting to talk about a new masculinity. So in conclusion, what would that mean? Well, fundamentally, it would mean that men in particular are going to be emotionally more responsive rather than reactive. And I'm sure most of us as men here who have had children at some point have gone from 0 to ballistic in 0.5 seconds when their kids have stepped out of line. And one of the things that I teach parents, and particularly men, is let's slow it down. We don't need to yell at them as the first port of call. The other bit is that rather than being really restrictive and almost seeing change as a problem, let's embrace it. Let's become emotionally and behaviourally more flexible. I don't need to reach for the sword every time someone disagrees with me. And so the offshoot of that would be that as men, we would start to become significantly more resilient. And that's one of the big challenges that we're seeing in society, in culture right now, is that both amongst boys, young men, and older men, our level of resilience is declining. We're really struggling with that. So, to sum it up, really, that new masculinity would allow Finn and his contemporaries to step into a culture that was going to be much, much better for them. It's a place where they can grow up to be good men who can become great. Thank you.